The scent hit her first. A clean, crisp perfume of green stems and cool petals, a fragrance so potent it cut through the sterile, conditioned air of the 88th floor. Nia breathed it in, a slow, deliberate inhale that felt like the first real breath she'd taken all day. They sat on the corner of her minimalist white desk, a cloud of impossible white in a world of chrome and black marble. White roses. Dozens of them, maybe 100, packed so tightly into a crystal vase that they formed a single, perfect sphere of bloom. A giddy, unfamiliar lightness fluttered in her chest. She was 20 years old, an ocean away from home, and someone had sent her flowers. Not just any flowers, but a display so extravagant it was causing the couriers in the lobby to whisper. A small, genuine smile touched her lips as she ran a finger over a velvety petal. She thought of the barista at the coffee shop downstairs, the one with the kind eyes and the easy laugh. Maybe? Or the young man from the finance department who always found a reason to walk past her desk. The anonymity was part of the thrill. For a moment, she wasn't just Nia, the hyper-efficient assistant to Mr. Tanaka. She was a girl who was admired. Her computer chimed, pulling her back. A meeting in Singapore needed rescheduling. The jet had to be refueled and ready for a midnight departure. A multi-billion-dollar acquisition was faltering, and she needed to get the lead counsel on the line now. She turned back to her 3 monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard, the cloud of white roses a pleasant distraction in her periphery. Her world was a fortress of quiet competence, a series of tasks executed with flawless precision. It was how she survived in this place, at this altitude, in the orbit of a man like him. The heavy glass door to the inner office slid open without a sound. The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. Kenji Tanaka moved like the space belonged to him because it did. The city of Tokyo, sprawling out in a glittering panorama from the floor-to-ceiling windows, was merely his backdrop. He was not a large man, but his presence consumed all available oxygen. Today he wore a charcoal suit by a designer whose name was a quiet whisper of old money and new power. It was cut so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, more formidable skin. His tie was silver silk, the knot precise and unforgiving. At his wrist, the face of a Patek Philippe gleamed, tracking time in a world where his time was the only currency that mattered. He stopped beside her desk. She didn't look up, her focus locked on the email she was drafting. She could feel his stillness, the sheer weight of his attention. It was a physical pressure.
He didn't speak.
He never wasted words. He simply waited, knowing the world would pivot to him. "The Henderson contract is on your desk for final signature," she said, her voice even and professional. "And your call with the board is confirmed for 4. He made no sound of acknowledgement. The silence stretched. It was a familiar tool of his, a silence that could pry open secrets and force confessions. But it wasn't aimed at the Henderson contract. She felt his gaze shift, landing on the explosion of white at the corner of her desk. That's when she made the mistake of looking up. His eyes, the color of dark, wet slate, were fixed on the roses. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic indifference, was tight. A muscle jumped in his jaw, a tiny, violent tremor that betrayed a crack in the perfect, cold facade. "Who got you those flowers?" The question was not conversational. It was not curious. It was low, guttural, an accusation ground out from somewhere deep and primal. The air crackled. The giddy warmth Nia had felt just moments before curdled into a cold knot of dread in her stomach. I'm not sure," she stammered, her professional composure fracturing. There was no card. He took a step closer. He smelled of cedar and something else, something metallic and cold, like rain on steel. His gaze flickered from the flowers to her face, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. It was not anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was possession. A raw, predatory claim that had never been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, and she had just been too naive to see it. "White roses," he said, his voice ablade. A declaration. An insult. The gray wool of her sweater felt too thin, offering no protection. Get rid of them, the command was absolute. I don't want to see them when I return. He turned and walked back into his office, the glass door sliding shut, sealing him away in his silent kingdom. Nia stared after him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the beautiful, innocent flowers, their scent now seeming cloying, suffocating. An insult? A declaration? What had felt like a sweet, secret gesture now felt like a harbinger, a mark painted on her door. With trembling hands, she stood up, gathered the heavy crystal vase, and walked toward the small kitchenette. She dumped the entire bouquet, water and all, into the trash receptacle with a wet, final slap of petals against stainless steel. The joy was gone, ripped out and replaced with a gnawing unease. She had worked for Kenji Tanaka for 6 months. She had seen him dismantle corporate rivals with a single phone call. She had seen him eviscerate a senior partner for a minor mistake with 3 clipped sentences. But she had never, not once, seen him lose control. Until now, over a stupid bouquet of flowers. Her desk phone buzzed. It was his private line. She took a breath, smoothed her sweater, and answered. Yes, Mr. Tanaka? Cancel my evening. His voice came through the speaker, devoid of any emotion once more. The mask was back in place. You'll be accompanying me to a meeting. Of course. Where will we be going? I'll send the details to your car. Be downstairs in 5 minutes. The line went dead. She stared at the phone. Your car. Not a car. Not a taxi. A car was already waiting for her. He had already decided. She had no choice. The flowers were gone, but the mystery of them lingered, a question mark hanging in the air. And now, she was being pulled from the safety of her desk, from the known world of spreadsheets and schedules, and into his. The glass walls of her office had never felt so much like a cage. She slid onto the soft seat, her sensible work heels sinking into the plush floor mats. The door closed with a heavy, sealing thud, shutting out the sounds of the city and locking her inside. The address that pinged on the car's integrated tablet was not for a corporate headquarters or a high-end restaurant in Ginza. It was in the warehouse district near the docks, a part of Tokyo that didn't glitter, a place of shadows and shipping containers. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, seeped into her stomach. This was not a board meeting. This was something else entirely. When they arrived, the Maybach slid into a discreet alley beside a featureless concrete building. The driver got out and opened her door. Another man, dressed in an identical dark suit, was waiting. He bowed his head slightly. Not to her. To the car itself, as if its occupant was already inside. She was merely a package being delivered. She was led through a steel door and down a narrow hallway. The air grew thick with the smell of expensive whiskey and cigar smoke. They emerged into a large, dimly lit room. It was a private club, but not the kind she was used to seeing in magazines. There were no velvet ropes or flashing lights. The furniture was dark wood and leather, the decor minimalist and severe. She felt like a specimen under glass, her gray sweater and simple black trousers suddenly feeling like a costume, marking her as an outsider. And then she saw him. Kenji was seated in a high-backed leather chair at the far end of the room, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the table beside him. He was not looking at her. He was watching a heavy-set man across from him, a man with a scarred face and ink peeking out from the collar of his shirt. Even from a distance, Nia could feel the lethal stillness radiating from Kenji. He was a predator in his natural habitat. The man with the scar grinned, a flash of gold in his mouth. Tanaka, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. You have developed a new taste. More exotic than the last 1 inch. His eyes flickered to Nia, dismissive and crude. The room went dead silent. Nia's blood ran cold. The last one. The words hung in the air like poison. Kenji didn't move a muscle. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the silence stretch until it was a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it all the more terrifying. Ishikawa, he said, the name spoken like a curse. You mistake this for a negotiation. It is a notification. Your operations in Shinjuku will cease by midnight tomorrow. If they do not, I will burn your entire organization to the ground, and I will start with the tongue in your mouth that you use to disrespect what is mine." He still hadn't looked at Nia, but the words, "what is mine," landed like a physical blow. He wasn't talking about his territory. He was talking about her. Ishikawa's grin vanished. The color drained from his face. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back, and left the room without another word, his men scrambling after him. Kenji remained seated, his gaze fixed on the spot where the other man had been. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up his glass and drained it in one swallow. Only then did he turn his head and look at Nia. His eyes were black holes, empty of everything but a cold, desolate fury. He gestured for her to come closer. Her legs felt like lead, but she obeyed, walking the long distance across the silent room until she stood before him. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. The ride back to the Shinjuku Tower was a study in silence. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but inside the car, the world had shrunk to the space between them. The air was thick with unspoken things. Nia stared at her hands, twisting them in her lap. The image of the man Ishikawa, the name Akari whispered in the back of her mind, the possessive claim in Kenji's voice. It all swirled into a terrifying picture she was only just beginning to understand. He wasn't just a CEO. He was something far more dangerous. The men in that room were not executives. They were soldiers. And she, his assistant, had just been declared his territory in the middle of a war. As the car pulled up to the main entrance of a skyscraper, she expected to be dismissed. She expected him to send her home, to push her back into the safe, sterile world of the 88th floor. But the driver didn't move. Kenji turned his head, his face profiled against the glittering city. "They always go for the one thing you can't replace," he said, his voice low, almost inaudible. It wasn't directed at her. He was speaking to a ghost in the car with them, a memory that clearly still had the power to wound him. A woman he had failed to protect. A shame he carried like a shroud. This was his wound, the crack in his armor. He was powerful, feared, a king in his steel and glass castle. But he had lost someone. And the thought of losing someone again was the one thing that could make him reckless. He finally looked at her. "Your services are no longer required for the evening. You may go." It was a test. An out. A chance for her to run back to her ordinary life and pretend none of this had happened. She could walk away, take the train home, and draft a resignation letter in the morning. Her heart screamed at her to go, but her mind saw the flicker of profound, crushing loneliness in his eyes. The isolation of a man who could command armies but couldn't share his own pain. Her own voice surprised her when it came out, steady and clear. "You have a board call with the Shanghai office in 30 minutes, she said, her tone reverting to the cool efficiency he was used to. "You'll need the quarterly reports compiled and cross-referenced." "I'll bring them up." It was a choice. A deliberate step back from the precipice, but not away from him. She was choosing to stay, to retreat to the familiar ground of their professional relationship, because the raw, personal territory they had just crossed was too terrifying to navigate. But it was still a choice to stay. A long moment passed. He searched her face, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, Nia, not just the competent machine at the desk outside his door. A flicker of something, surprise? Gratitude, passed through his dark eyes before the mask slid back into place. "Fine," he said, and turned to look out the window again. Back on the 88th floor, the silence was different. It was no longer the empty, sterile silence of a corporate office after hours. It was a shared silence, heavy with the events of the evening. The city lights were a river of diamonds below, but they offered no warmth. She worked at her desk, compiling the reports he needed. He was in his office, the glass door slightly ajar. She could see him standing by the window, his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the skyline. He had loosened his silver tie, the first sign of dishevelment she had ever witnessed. When the reports were ready, she made a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the quiet space. She poured a single cup, black, just how he liked it, and carried it into his office. He didn't turn as she approached. "Mr. Tanaka," she said softly, "the reports. And your coffee." She set the files on the edge of his massive mahogany desk and held out the ceramic mug. He turned then, and the weariness in his face was stark under the sharp office lighting. He looked exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of his empire, of his war, was pressing down on him. He reached for the mug, and his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was a jolt of pure electricity, a static shock that arced between them. It was nothing and it was everything. His skin was cool, his touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't pull away. His fingers lingered against hers for a fraction of a second too long. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. His eyes, dark and intense, were locked on hers. The vast, empty space between boss and assistant, between his world and hers, collapsed into this single, charged point of contact. The mask was gone. In its place was a man, vulnerable and raw, stripped of his power and his pretense. She could see the ghost he was chasing, the shame he was running from, the terrifying loneliness of his throne. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they couldn't say. "Nia," he said. Just her name. But he said it differently than anyone else ever had. It wasn't a summons. It wasn't a label. It was a sound that felt like a question, a plea, and a confession all at once. The next morning, they were waiting for her outside her apartment building. Two men, both in the same dark, impeccably tailored suits as the men from the club. They didn't speak. One held the door to a black sedan, the same model as the car from last night. Her freedom, she realized with a sickening lurch, was gone. She was no longer just an employee. She was an asset to be guarded. His claim was now a physical cage. The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. She answered emails, scheduled flights, and fielded calls, all while the two silent sentinels stood just outside her office door. Kenji was remote, colder than ever, the brief moment of connection from the night before seemingly erased. But she felt his eyes on her whenever she entered his office, a heavy, watchful gaze that tracked her every move. The tension was a high wire strung between their two desks, and she was terrified of falling. The fall came that evening. He dismissed her at her usual time, his voice clipped. "My men will see you home." She wanted to argue, to demand her life back, but she knew it was pointless. She was living in his world now, by his rules. In the crowded Shinjuku subway station, surrounded by the river of evening commuters, she almost felt normal again. She clutched the strap of her bag, her two shadows keeping a discreet distance behind her. The noise, the lights, the sheer press of humanity was a comfort after the sterile silence of the tower. It happened fast. A sudden surge in the crowd, a shove from the side. Someone grabbed her arm, hard. Another man moved to block her path. Their faces were grim, their eyes cold and empty. They were not commuters. "Ishi Kawagumi sends its regards," one of them hissed, his grip tightening on her arm like a vice. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She opened her mouth to scream, but a hand clamped over it. Then chaos erupted. Her shadows moved with a speed that was inhuman. There was no shouting, no fanfare. Just the sickening, wet thud of fists hitting flesh, the grunt of pain, the swift, brutal choreography of violence. Then he was there. Kenji. He appeared out of the crowd as if from nowhere, a wraith in a dark coat. He wasn't frantic or enraged. He moved with a chilling, surgical precision. One of the men came at him with a knife, a short, wicked-looking blade. Kenji sidestepped the lunge, his hand a blur, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the grimy station floor. He didn't kill. He dismantled. He reached her in 3 strides, his hand closing around her arm, pulling her out of the fray and tight against his chest. His body was a wall of solid muscle, a shield between her and the world. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, or maybe it was her own. For a single, unguarded moment, as he looked down at her, his face pale in the fluorescent lights, his control shattered. She saw pure, undiluted terror in his eyes. The terror of almost being too late. The terror of failing to protect someone again. The fight was over in seconds. The men from the Ishikawagumi were gone, vanished back into the crowd or lying motionless on the ground, attended to by Kenji's silent soldiers. He held her for a moment longer, his grip iron-tight, his breath coming in harsh rasps. Then the mask was back. He released her, his face becoming a cold, hard mask of fury. "Get her in the car," he snarled at one of his men. This time he didn't take her to her apartment. He took her to his. A penthouse that occupied the entire top 2 floors of the tower, a place of stark, beautiful minimalism with windows that looked down on the whole of creation. He had a shallow cut on his forearm, a thin red line where the knife had grazed him. He ignored it, pacing the vast living room like a caged tiger. "They will not stop," he said, his voice tight with rage. "They know you are my weakness." She watched him, her own fear slowly being replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. She walked to the marble-clad bathroom and found a first aid kit. She came back and stood in front of him, blocking his path. "Stop moving," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked down at her, surprised. She took the kit from his unresisting hand. Her fingers were trembling, but her movements were steady as she opened a sterile wipe and began to clean the cut. The simple, intimate act silenced his rage. He stood perfectly still, watching her as she worked, his gaze burning into her. The wound wasn't deep, but it would need a few stitches. She found the small suture kit and, with a competence she didn't know she possessed, she began to close the wound. She was no longer just his assistant. She was tending to the wounds of his world, crossing a line she could never uncross. When she was finished, her fingers lingered on his skin. He didn't pull away. His free hand came up, his touch surprisingly gentle as he cupped her jaw, tilting her face up to his. "The flowers weren't from an admirer," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "They were a threat. From them. A message, to let me know they could touch what is mine." It was a confession. Not of love, but of ownership. A dangerous, absolute claim that should have sent her running. But she didn't run. She leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement. "I know." The final proof came the next day. Kenji's head of security, a stern man named Hideo, showed her a photograph on his phone. It was a picture of her bed, in her own apartment. On her pillow, where her head should have been, lay a single, perfect white rose. They had been in her home. They had been in her most private space. The threat was no longer a shadow. It was breathing down her neck. The war had to end. Kenji planned a meeting with Ishikawa, the head of the rival clan. A trap set at a neutral location, a high-end restaurant with a private room he owned. He was going to end the threat, for good. "You will stay here," he commanded, gesturing to the gilded cage of his penthouse. "You will not leave. Hideo and his men will be outside the door. You will be safe." She nodded, but a cold unease settled over her. While he met with his lieutenants in his home office, she paced the living room. On his desk, he had left the blueprints for the restaurant. Not the decorative ones, but the full architectural plans. She had spent months memorizing the layouts of all his properties for logistics and event planning. Her eyes scanned the familiar lines. She saw the private room, the main exits, the kitchen access. And she saw the emergency escape route he'd planned for himself, a service corridor that led to a back alley. Her blood ran cold. She remembered an addendum from 6 months ago. City Works. A gas main replacement. That entire alley had been excavated. The corridor didn't lead to an escape. It led to a 30-foot drop into an open construction pit. It was a death trap. Whether Ishikawa knew it or not, Kenji was planning to walk right into it. She couldn't call him. She couldn't interrupt. To do so would be to question his authority in front of his men, an unforgivable offense. Her mind raced. She thought of Hideo, the stoic head of security. He was loyal, but his loyalty was to Kenji's safety above all else. She found a tablet, pulled up the city planning permits she had filed herself months ago, and highlighted the relevant section. She wrote a simple and signed note. Check the alley. City Works Permit 7B. She called Hideo to the door on the pretense of needing water. As he turned, she slipped the tablet into the hands of the younger guard standing behind him, a man whose face she recognized as being newer, more eager to prove himself. She met his eyes for a split second, her gaze conveying an urgency that transcended words. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod and slid the tablet away. She had done all she could. She had acted, not as a victim to be protected, but as a player in the game. She had used her knowledge, her mind, to protect him. Hours later, he returned. He was not unscathed. There was a bruise high on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were raw. But he was alive. He walked into the penthouse, ignoring Hideo's attempt at a report. His eyes scanned the room, looking for her. She was not in the living room. She was waiting for him in his office, standing by the great windows, looking down at the kingdom he ruled. She had chosen to meet him on his ground, in the heart of his power. He walked directly to her, his steps silent and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask how she knew. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw everything. The cold mask of the CEO, the ruthless fury of the clan leader, it was all stripped away, leaving something raw and absolute. You, he said, his voice low, a gravelly sound that was both a surrender and a coronation. You are my only vulnerability, and my greatest strength. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, a truth that now defined them both. It meant more than any poem, any promise. Her old life was gone. She could never go back to being just Nia, the girl with the gray sweater and the quiet apartment. She was tied to this man, to his danger, to his darkness. The cost was her freedom. The cost was her peace. He had paid a price, too. He had exposed his heart, the one chink in his armor, and laid it at her feet. He held out his hand. It was not a request. It was an offer, a key to a cage made of steel and silk. To take it was to accept everything he was and everything she would become with him. She looked from his hand, strong and scarred, to his face, to the dark, intense eyes that saw all of her. Behind him, the lights of Tokyo glittered, a universe of shadow and brilliance. Her own hand, steady now, lifted to meet his. The touch was not a spark, but a weld, fusing them together. It was a promise and a sentence, a fate she was choosing with her eyes wide open.